Hello, we are the Environmentalists. I am Nicole Arguillo and my partner is here, Nikki Bayani. And we would like to share one thing, and that is climate change is one of the world's most pressing problems. Now, in the Philippines, if you remember the onslaught of Yolanda and Typhoon Ondoy in recent years, which has been felt by many Filipinos, it seems that it is a clear symptom that calamities such as these is a part of the devastating effects of climate change. So, is there any hope for us in this case or for the world? Well, we'd like to discuss that in four parts. And these are where are we in terms of CO2 emissions and renewable output in the country? Where are we going? Is there any environmental goal or goals that we are striving for in the Philippines? Third is how do we get there? Are there any countries that um, could serve as good examples? And what's next? From those good examples, can they possibly be applied in our situation? So first, we'd like to look into where are we or how we've been doing. And in terms of carbon emissions per capita, it seems like the Philippines has always emitted less than a quarter of the world average. And even if compared to the performance with the region that the Philippines belongs to, which is the East Asia and Pacific region, we still do not emit as much carbon. And this seems to be the case because there is a strong and positive correlation or relationship between CO2 emissions and GDP, with an R coefficient of 0.95. And as part of the low and middle income groups of countries, this could explain why we have such low emissions on average. And you might think this seems like good news. However, unfortunately, research shows that the lowest emitters tend to also be the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change as well. And there's that inequity where the large players do not suffer the consequences of their actions. And so, because of this, the rich and the not so rich countries alike must work together for a better world.
Alright, now that we have data on carbon emissions, we will now move on to the renewable energy output in the Philippines. And our renewable energy output is above world average, but it has been in a declining trend. And for the purposes of this presentation, we will define renewable energy output as the share of electricity generated by renewable power plants as compared to total electricity generated by all types of plants, whether renewable or not renewable. So even though our electricity consumption in terms of the absolute quantity is growing, the percent share of renewable energy output is declining, which shows that our output is stagnant or we are not ramping up our renewable energy capacity as compared to the growing electricity demand in the Philippines. And given this information, we can say that yes, the Philippines has a good start in terms of carbon emissions. We're lower than the world average. In terms of renewable energy output, we are above world average, but we can still further improve. Which brings us to the next part of the presentation, and that is where are we going or what are the environmental commitments of the Philippines? So, first off, for renewable energy output, the Philippines has committed to a 35% share of renewable energy as compared to all sources of energy by 2030. And in 2014, we are at 25%, so we still have to bridge that 10% gap. In terms of carbon emissions, yes, the Philippines has a low carbon emissions as compared to the world average, but we are also vulnerable to the risks associated with climate change. That's why the Philippines has committed to reduce its carbon emissions by 70% in 2030. And our goal is to have a 0.83 metric tons of carbon emitted by that year. So, given our environmental goals, how do we get there? Specifically, we looked at countries which have best practices in carbon emissions and renewable energy output, and we try to see what can we learn from them. So, first, for our renewable energy output, did you know that the Latin America and Caribbean has the highest percentage share of renewable energy output, and that is as compared to the world average and as compared to the other regions as well. Specifically, if we rank all countries in terms of the highest percentage of renewable energy output, Paraguay is the number one country in the world, and Paraguay is located in Latin America and Caribbean. So we did a case study in Paraguay, and their actions showed that the government signed joint treaties with other countries to develop renewable energy sources, specifically with their neighbors, Brazil and Argentina. And they also passed laws that mandate a certain percentage of power to come from renewable energy. Given this information, we learned that the government really plays a big role in shaping the renewable energy consumption of a country, and Paraguay is a middle income country. They are not rich. So if they can pass renewable energy laws and explore joint treaties with other countries to further develop their renewable energy resources, then we can as well. And so we've discussed about renewable energy, but the data in the Philippine setting is very promising because it shows that as the renewable energy output goes up, the CO2 emissions go down. So we can hit two birds with one stone. And to talk about carbon emissions, here is Nicole.
And Nikki earlier talked about Paraguay in terms of renewable energy, so now we will look at that region as well in terms of carbon emissions. And if you see here, the LAC region is actually the second highest contributor to the world's carbon emissions. If we further drill that down, you will see that one country stands out in that region, and that is Aruba. And over the course of 6 decades, you will see that the world average here in blue has looked flat in comparison. It's very close to zero in comparison to Aruba's performance. That is because the world average of carbon emissions per capita does not go any higher than 10, whereas Aruba has gone up to the hundreds, 200s, and even past 300 at some point. If you remember earlier, the Philippines was um, emitting less than a fourth of the world average. So if you were to compare Aruba and the Philippines, there would be an even greater disparity. And we'd like to call your attention to this point here in the line graph, where in 1985 to 1986, Aruba suffered a 98.55% drop in carbon emissions in just 1 year, which was most likely caused by the shutdown of the Lago Oil and Transport Company. Now, just to give you some historic context, the Aruba was once under the rule of the Netherlands, and in the 1920s, they had set up an oil refinery there. But due to financial troubles, they were forced to shut it down, which has also seemed to cause, again, the drastic and dramatic drop in carbon emissions. And this is further evidenced by the breakdown in carbon emissions in terms of solid, liquid, and gas. And liquid fuel consumption seems to dominate clearly here, which is, in this case, in Aruba's case, petroleum. And so Aruba has done well by itself, but it has also showed the most improvement in the whole world. You can see here Aruba in comparison to Luxembourg and the countries succeeding it, the difference is very great. So what we did was we compared the difference between 1960 emissions and 2016 emissions. And so you might think, after the disappearance or the shutdown of the largest employer in Aruba, did that mean the economic downfall of Aruba? That doesn't seem to be the case. Because in Aruba, the four main industries are aloe, gold, petroleum, and tourism. And so, in fact, even when the carbon emissions went down, their GDP did not follow suit. In fact, there was a steady increase in general for that country. And Aruba even got the nickname Las Vegas of the Caribbean, which means that they were able to find other means to make a living that did not necessarily bring a negative impact on the environment there.
All right. Now, given this information about Paraguay and Aruba, the next step is what's next, or what can the Philippines learn from these best practices? So, for the Philippines, as a recap, In terms of carbon emissions, we are lower than the world average. And in terms of renewable energy output as a percentage share, we are above world average, but the trend is that we are declining. And we have a good start, but we can still further improve. How? And that brings us to our recommendations, which are to pass more laws to promote renewable energy production, to explore the potential of different renewable energy sources suitable in the Philippine setting, to check the possibility of joint explorations to harness the renewable energy potential of the Philippines, and to shift to more sustainable means of livelihood that does not come at the cost of the environment. For example, tourism. And as David Suzuki said, our very being and essence depends on Mother Earth. We hope that this presentation helped us become more aware about carbon emissions and renewable energy output and their impact on Mother Earth.